Hey, discerned listeners, this is Chapter 7 in my deep dive on apologies. In this episode, I'm going to talk about apologies and forgiveness in therapy, what sort of interventions you might use as a therapist, and what sort of things you might want to seek in your own therapy with forgiveness and apologies. There are things you can do in session, in couple and family therapy, maybe even apologies and forgiveness between therapist and client, but also there are things that you can talk about in terms of apologizing and forgiving outside of the therapeutic office. You know, an individual client might talk about apologizing to someone else, their partner or a past relationship, that sort of thing, or allowing forgiveness, going down the process of forgiveness. Forgiveness often, particularly with significant transgressions, is a very significant emotional journey. You don't just say, I forgive someone. There's a lot of things you have to go through. There's a lot of meaning making and grieving and feeling and expressing and hearing each other, that sort of thing. So that's what today's lecture is going to be on in my deep dive, available to patrons only. But as an introduction, I thought I would continue my analysis of Chris Brown's apology to Rihanna about 15 years ago. In the last chapter introduction, I watched the first public apology that he provided. And then later on, he's on Larry King talking, I think, about the incident. So I'm guessing there will be more to the apology here. Full disclosure, I know nothing about Chris Brown and Rihanna. I've heard their music, but while all this was happening in the news, I didn't have cable television because I couldn't afford it 15 years ago. Well, I probably could have afforded it, but in terms of my budget, it would have been a hardship. And so I didn't watch any television, and I had really no idea what was going on in the world. And so this completely just was lost to me. Of course, you'd have to live under a rock to not know at least some of the details. But anyway, so full disclosure, I don't know anything about it. Let's watch.
Tonight, Chris Brown exclusive. Why he pled guilty to felony assault. About the infamous photo.
Okay, so I didn't know that he pled guilty to felony assault, and that photograph, which I'm not sure, but that might have been leaked against her will, that photograph. Pretty horrific photograph, honestly. And by the way, trigger warning on this episode with the introduction here, because obviously we will be talking about intimate partner violence. I'm guessing they might get into some graphic detail.
With us tonight on Larry King Live are Chris Brown, his mother Joyce Hawkins, and his attorney Mark Garagos. Chris entered a guilty plea on June 22nd, a deal that allowed him to avoid jail time. He pled guilty to felony assault after a widely publicized incident with his girlfriend Rihanna. A second felony charge, making criminal threats, was dropped, and Chris was sentenced to 5 years probation, 6 months of community labor. We thank you all for coming. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
This had to be the...
So one of the things that research has found that is a factor in receiving forgiveness or acceptance of the apology, which are two different things, by the way. Listen to my deep dive for information on that. But research has found that when the transgressor has experienced negative consequences as a result of their behavior, or maybe even just in life in general, then the harmed individual is much more likely to forgive and accept the apology. The thinking is that if Chris Brown, say, went to prison for 10 years and had his career completely torn apart, and he goes to Rihanna, he goes to the public and says, I'm sorry, on average, according to research, he's more likely to have his apology accepted and receive forgiveness. Whereas if he didn't receive enough, at least what people think should be the commensurate consequences for his behavior, then people are less likely. That's just one of the things to consider. If you have transgressed upon your partner, for example, when you have incurred a consequence, like you've had an emotional consequence, like you've had a lot of remorse, like it's plagued you, maybe even you entered into some minor depression for a couple of weeks because of how remorseful you feel and how sad you feel and how worried you feel about losing your relationship with the person. If you emphasize that, as long as it's genuine and truthful, you might actually get the other person to really understand what you're going through and accept your apology and forgive you more readily. I think that's what it has to do with. As humans, I think we evolved to understand fairness, and when someone transgresses on something, someone, but they have a lot of consequences as a result of that, I think people feel like there's a balance. Whereas if someone transgresses and they don't really experience any kind of consequence, then it's harder for us to forgive. And I think that applies to the public as well, that if they were to hear what he went through, I'm guessing there were a number of different reactions back then. And I'm sure some of you know all the reactions that were happening. But given what we just heard, that he pled guilty and that actually got him out of jail time, and he is on probation and he has 6 months of community service, essentially, maybe picking up garbage. I don't know. So if people considered that to be a severe consequence or enough of a consequence to balance things out, then people are going to be more likely to forgive him. Whereas if they thought he didn't get enough of a punishment, then they're less likely to forgive him, according to research. And what we didn't hear was mandated domestic violence treatment. And maybe he went through an assessment and it was found that he didn't need that, but I'd be surprised. And that would be the thing I would think the courts would actually let me go back. Let's rewind.
And Chris was sentenced to 5 years probation, 6 months of community labor. We thank you all for...
So yeah, I didn't hear anything about mandated treatment, which surprises me because usually that's just par for the course, because it's the thing that is most likely to reduce the likelihood of it happening again, which is, of course, why we have the justice system. We don't want to just punish him because we feel like he needs a punishment. We want him to reform. We want him to not do this in the future so that there aren't future victims. And the only way you can do that effectively, according to research, is through domestic violence treatment, intimate partner violence treatment. I was a clinician in a mandated group for men who were convicted of these crimes. They were caught and convicted and reluctantly mandated to come to my group. There was another clinician as well that specialized in intimate partner violence, and we were there to help them change in some very fundamental ways, their attitudes, their personality, their traumas, helping to set them up with ongoing care as well. They were forced by law to come to the group for a year or longer, depending on our recommendation. And I found it to be highly effective. And research shows that as well. And without that, it's not likely that people just spontaneously will change their personality and their attitudes. Now, maybe he was mandated, but we didn't hear that. I'm guessing we would have. Now, maybe he voluntarily is going. That would happen occasionally. Sometimes people would say, I actually recognize I have a problem. I've tried to change my behavior. I can't. I'm going to go to a domestic violence treatment group because I just want to improve myself. I want to change. I don't want to hurt my partner anymore. Maybe he did that.
How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
This had to be the worst period of your life.
Yeah, possibly, yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Are things calm for you now? Are you into it?
I think it's more relief now that everything is kind of all said and done as far as like what I have to do and what's going on. I think it's no more media frenzy for them to kind of blow out of proportion anymore.
So you're glad it's over?
Yeah.
All right. It's not encouraging. I don't know his story. I don't know his journey. I don't know how Rihanna feels about it. I don't know anything. His introduction here, he doesn't seem to be taking it very seriously. If he's trying to convey remorse and that he cares, I wouldn't have responded the way that he did. I would have said, Larry King asked, this must have been the worst time in your life. And he's like, I don't know.
This had to be the worst period of your life.
Yeah, possibly, yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Are things calm for you now? Are you into it?
I think it's more relief now that everything is kind of all said and done as far as like what I have to do and what's going on. I think it's no more media frenzy for them to kind of blow out of proportion anymore.
So you're glad it's over?
Yeah.
What did you plead? Explain quickly, Mark, what he pled guilty to.
Assault, basically, was what it is, a felony assault charge. Sentenced to 5 years of probation, as you said, 180 days of what Judge Schnegg calls community labor, and he has to undergo a domestic violence program for 1 year.
Okay. I was going to say, what? Okay, all right, good. Yeah, exactly what I thought. It's standard. And I will tell you that it's hard to go through a program like that without changing. 95% of the time, and it was only men that I treated. There were groups for women, but I was treating the men group. And 95% of the time, the men entered, if not 100% of the time, the men would enter the group reluctant. They were upset. They would, they'd play along because they knew they'd get in trouble, possibly even go to prison if they didn't comply with treatment, which is always kind of weird as a therapist that people would be mandated to talk to me. I was always trying to be, look, I want you to feel comfortable. If you don't want to answer a question, don't. I trust that we will develop a relationship over time. Don't think of me as a member of the government that is somehow hanging, lording over you or something. Plus, at the time, I was pretty young. I was in my late 20s. Most of my clients were older than me. So most of the time, they were reluctant and were kind of mailing it in the beginning. But over time, there's a lot of invitation for the individuals to look at themselves and go, often the men would say, I thought this group was just going to be about shaming me, but really this is about me looking at myself and having compassion for myself and figuring out what happened to me that made me do this sort of thing. Like in those moments when I am triggered and I'm completely unaware of my emotional state, what's happening? Because usually, almost all the time, not all the time, but most of the time, what was going on for these men was they were afraid of losing their partners. And that doesn't excuse the violence, of course, or the intimidation or anything along those lines, but it would begin with the husbands feeling distant or rejected or their feelings were hurt. And given their upbringing, they basically had no way of being able to express that or even know that was happening for them. And it would just build and build, sometimes over the span of their entire lifetime or over a week's time. And they would have no way of talking about it. They would try to signal in these very dysfunctional ways. And then all of that pain they would just explode into violence and intimidation. And once they crossed that line, and they had been indoctrinated into a misogynistic society that told them that that's what you do. When a woman gets out of line, you put her in place. And so they think, well, this is the natural course of things. This is how one expresses it. This is how men express themselves. And so you put those two things together, and they had that modeled to them, massive attachment injuries, no awareness of their emotions, no ability, and often drinking in the process, misogynistic indoctrination, and then that you get what you get. And so those two things had to be addressed, the misogyny and the attachment, emotional awareness, and management system. And so the men through this process would discover pretty quickly within a few months, especially watching other men in the group who were further along. And those men that were further along would talk to the newer guys and say, look, I was like you before. Because that was a whole part of the treatment model, was that the more senior members would talk to the more junior members and say, look, I was like you in the beginning, and let me tell you how I got to where I am now. I was like you. I thought this group would be a joke. I thought Kirk was a complete freak. I had long hair at the time, and I looked like I was a teenager, and yeah, so they would say that. And the treatment group was also kind of in a more rural area of Seattle. But anyway, so they would, the more senior guys would be like, I thought Kirk was this, grunge Seattle freak of some kind, but I have now come to learn that he's actually a really helpful fella. And I thought that the other treatment professional, I thought she was just a B word, but I've now come to realize that she's here to actually help and, go along with the program, because this isn't just a program to punish you. This is a program to enhance your life. Your life will get better, and as a result, you won't be violent anymore, and you'll actually stay out of prison and not hurt your partners, that kind of talk. And so anyway, that's all to say that if he did go through a program like that, he probably did change to some extent.
Do anything from picking up trash on the side of the street, washing cars, graffiti removal, anything. But it's the law, so I'm willing to do whatever they want me to do.
Is it fair?
To me, possibly everything comes with consequences, so I feel like definitely it is. And I have no misjudgment on what the judge is giving me, so I'm willing to do anything asked.
Okay, again, if he's trying to come across like he understands what he did was terrible, which it was, from what I understand, this is one of those things that the public figures will do when they're apologizing. And to some extent, people in interpersonal apologies will do as well, that they'll say the right thing, but they'll indicate something different. Let's rewind that, because Larry King asks him, do you think this was fair? And Chris Brown's like, and you get this feeling like he feels like it was unfair to him, that the judge imposed too much on him. But then he quickly follows it up with saying the words, which is, no, it was fair. And it sounds more like going through the motions. And so a whole other angle to me analyzing these apologies has to do with being able to detect what's happening for you. Because when you are receiving an apology and it isn't going well, the apology isn't sufficient, unless we have a lot of awareness of our emotions and of apologies in general, and we're able to differentiate in the moment, which can be hard because it could be really intense as someone is apologizing to us, we might not be able to know what is wrong. We just feel like something is wrong. So if someone's apologizing to you and they say the right words, but you still don't really feel satisfied, you still feel hurt, you don't feel ready to forgive, you don't feel like you want to accept the apology because it doesn't feel right, but you feel conflicted because you feel like, well, but he said all the words. So being able to know why is it that I feel like this apology isn't sufficient is important so that you can communicate to the person. So in an instance like this, if this was something that was bothering you, you would say, look, you're saying the words that you feel like you were fairly consequenced, but I'm not getting the impression that you are, which is fine, I guess, if that's how you feel, but be honest with me about that. So I could imagine being a member of society, hearing him say that and being like, because for a lot of people, they might think he wasn't consequenced enough, right? That he should have spent time in prison. I don't know. I don't know what the general feeling is about people. But.
So you feel it's fair?
Yeah.
The judge was very specific. She wanted labor.
Now, I will say that in a lot of situations like this, the most important thing that needs to happen is the treatment program, and also that the court supports the recommendation of the professionals, because sometimes men would enter the group and they would not really participate. They'd be there and they would do what they're supposed to do, but you could tell that they weren't really putting their heart into it. And so in those situations, for the public good and for the good of the individual, it was important that the judge actually listened to us, because we could say, by the way, he's not putting his heart and soul into it. We can tell. And so he needs another year of it. Or you need to tell him, sometimes it was, the probation officer, you need to tell the individual that unless they start meaningfully participating in it, then they will have that consequence that the court was holding over their head, meaning that it was usually jail time or prison time. So,
yeah.
The judge was very specific. She wanted labor involved in the punishment.
Yes.
What did that mean to you when she said that? Hard work?
Hard work, yeah, definitely. And I'm a very hard worker, so that's kind of, I wouldn't say second nature, but it's definitely something that I'm willing to do. As far as the actual, what I have to do, I felt personally that, as far as, not saying as a celebrity, because I don't exclude myself and try to become like, oh, I'm a celebrity, so I shouldn't be punished. But I feel like with what I'm capable of doing as far as influencing people, influencing kids, the youth, I can do a lot more to help the community other than picking up trash. But I'm not saying picking up trash is something wrong. I'm willing to do it. But I'm just saying I know I can do a lot more, which I intend to do aside from my community service.
Okay, hard to know exactly what's behind that emotionally for him. That is logical that if the judge, for example, mandated that he give weekly talks on air about domestic violence or trauma or something, that would go a long way to better society, potentially, depending on how it came across, right? So what he's saying there is logical, but at the same time, it kind of comes across like he resents the fact that they mandated that he do hard labor, essentially. And he also knows that the paparazzi will be there taking pictures of him, which if he did do those things, I'm sure that happened. And that is kind of a hardship, right? If you're just a regular citizen and you're picking up trash on the side of the road, then the consequence is you're picking up trash on the side of the road. But if you're a celebrity and you're picking up trash on the side of the road, then you have this additional consequence of people ridiculing you, taking pictures of you, following you around. Yeah, that seems like extra. Now, maybe the judge wanted him to have that experience, and maybe that would be helpful to his reformation. But the other thing that I just want to throw out there, and I have no idea, but what are the statistics regarding people who are convicted of this crime, or people that are found to be guilty of this sort of crime, regarding ethnicity and race, and what sort of consequences that they are given by the judicial system? So I don't know, but it seems possible, and I know that there are studies along these lines that find an association there, that when you are black or brown, you are much more likely to get a more severe sentence. And I'm just going to throw that out there. I don't know if that was a factor in this, obviously, but that could be part of the context. And if that was, then if you're Chris Brown, you could take issue with that, obviously. All right, well, I'll end it there. I didn't realize there would be this much to say. There's a lot to say about intimate partner violence that's separate from apology, but I thought I would use this opportunity to talk about that because that's important to raise awareness and for everyone to understand this sort of thing. So if you want to listen to the rest of this episode, you have to become a patron of the podcast by going to patreon.com. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.